Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing Peace in the Promised Land, a realist scenario edited by Dr. Srdja Trifkovic. This book is a collection of essays, about a dozen or so, on the history of the region, the key players over history and up to the present day. This book was written in 2006, so it's some years ago, but it's still very current in a lot of its information. And the last part of the book talks about possible peace solutions, and that's what this episode is about. My first two episodes, which I'll link to in the description in this mini series, have been first about the Nakba in 1948, in which Zionist terrorist militias went and murdered men, women, and children in their beds in broad daylight, drove them from the land, and helped to create the Zionist myth that people just fled. The second book that I reviewed was The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. I talked about the fact that the U.S. and Israel being great friends and quote unquote sharing values is a tenuous assertion to make at best. But what I didn't have a chance to talk about in that review, just there's so much to talk about, was it's a lose-lose-lose proposition for everyone. The current alliance between the U.S. and Israel. It loses for the Israelis because they don't have a chance to develop as a state without U.S. foreign aid. So they're just sort of crippled at this solution of just getting handouts, and cripples the United States because they don't have as many foreign policy options in the area because they're just stuck with this unconditional support of Israel no matter what. And it's bad for the region because it continues to mean that there is a flashpoint for wars that can lead to destabilizations in their own countries. So to set the stage for this, let's go back to 1948 briefly and realize that prior to May 15th, 1948, which is the end of the British Mandate of Palestine, 90% of the private property in the British Mandate of Palestine was owned by Arabs. Of the population of 2 million people, 1.4 million were Arabs. So the majority population of this land were Arabs. And the notion that they were not there was no Palestinian identity. Remember that the idea of nation states is quite a new one. For the majority of human history, we have been peoples. We have not been nation states with embassies and passports and currency and standing armies. These are all pretty new things. We have been peoples. And there was a Palestinian people, and there's documents and records you can find it in the 1920s and 1930s, long before 1948, in which people were identifying themselves and calling themselves Palestinians. They were being written about in newspapers as Palestinians. So this idea that Palestine doesn't exist, you don't have to have a nation state in order to be a people. Examples abound. We have the Basques in southern France and northern Spain. They are a people. They have their own language, they have their own customs, but they do not have their own country. One that's much closer to this region and is much more, shall we say, contentious and painful would be the Kurds. So the Kurds, they're spread out across Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and none of those nation states want to allow the Kurds to have their own population, not have their own state, not only because they would be in possession of a lot of oil, but they're just concerned about, having a new state on their borders. There's strategic reasons as well. But my point is there are peoples who don't have a state. So the idea that all peoples must have states, possibly, but there's all sorts of difficulties even when you have nation states. I could go into the Hungarians in Transylvania who live in Romania, the ethnically Russian Estonians who live in Estonia. But we don't have time for that today. I want to focus on the book. But I just want to point out the Zionist myth, which was continued to be repeated in comments from my previous two videos, is that the Palestinians started a war and their people fled, and that's what happened. There was no Palestinian state, therefore the Palestinians could not have started a war. Other Arab countries, who themselves quote unquote spoke for the Palestinians, invaded. Some of those people fled their homes because they didn't want to be caught in a battlefield. And Israel then said, we got to take that land because people fled. People tried to return to their homes and they were shot. And there's evidence of that in the Israeli state archives, which is what Ilan Pappé referenced in his book and what I talked about. So the myth, the Zionist myth that this was a land without a people with a land without people for a people with no land, that there was no one living here. It's not true. And the Arabs were the majority population. This was written by Evan Wilson, who served in the Division of Near Eastern Affairs of the State Department. It is no exaggeration to say that our relations with the entire Arab world have never recovered from the events of 1947 to 48, when we sided with the Jews against the Arabs and advocated a solution in Palestine, which went contrary to self-determination as far as the majority population of the country was concerned. So America's for majority and self-determination and freedom, unless it's the Arabs in Palestine, right? So we have to be clear that, is this person an anti-Semite, or is he just repeating what was the truth at the time, that the Arabs were the majority population, and then that dramatically changed post 1948 for any number of factors. Immigration's part of it, but people were driven away from their homes. And I should say at the outset, this book is about peace, right? And this is the third in a mini series. I talk about the Palestinians, talk about the Israelis. I do believe peace is possible. One of the ways that I do think about that is I had a chance to visit earlier this year the home of Ataturk, the birthplace of Ataturk. And where is it? It's in Thessaloniki, Greece. So I'm sure that must be strange and I got to see some Turkish people who were very excited to be in this house. But you have to think about that. The father of the Turkish nation, his birthplace is in Greece, and I think there's a message there about, the Ottoman Empire and how things are. But he was part of what I think are the two things that are necessary for this peace to happen. As peace happened between the Greeks and the Turks, who have no love lost for each other historically. So it's in the same region as the Israelis and the Palestinians, and they have the same sort of animosity, and I would say that animosity went for centuries in a different way than the recent Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Ataturk had the political capital, so the two things of timing and leadership, he possessed both, and he had willing counterparters among the Greeks, and they arranged for a peaceful population transfer. If you don't know about this, about 1.5 million ethnic Turks moved from the newly established borders of Greece after the Ottoman Empire, and they moved into Turkey, and about 500,000 ethnic Greeks moved into Greece from Turkey. And there were property restitutions, etc. So, for example, if I was an ethnic Turk and I was living in Greece and I had a farm and 2 cows, it would be registered. And when I arrived in Turkey, the Turkish government noted I had a farm and 2 cows, and they would try to either restore that to me in an equivalent, or they would pay me the money so that I could get a farm and 2 cows. This happened peacefully with no conflict. So Greece and Turkey were able to arrange a peaceful population transfer. And whether you want to get into whether population transfer is good, because this is a form of ethnic cleansing as well. But that aside, a peaceful transfer is possible between 2 long-time enemies. So that's why I believe that's possible. But you have to have the right timing, and you have to have the right leadership. Now that I've talked about those big issues, let's get into the nitty-gritty about peace for Israel and Palestine. You'll find lots and lots of articles that go deep into the major points of difference. Don't have time to do that today, so I picked 5 areas, and I'm trying to go from least difficult to most difficult. So, as I say, I do believe peace is possible, but the Israelis and the Palestinians have to want it more than the international community does. The international community has tried Oslo, Camp David, the Y River. You can't make people care more about peace than the actual stakeholders. The stakeholders have to care the most, and sometimes that means more violence and more bloodshed has to happen until it's worn out. And yes, maybe we can talk more about that. I want to make sure I don't go too long, as I did on my last video. So the first is termination of hostilities. So both Israel and Palestine have to have a ceasefire, and Palestinians have to make sure that their most militant, non-compromising people cannot speak for them and cannot conduct suicide bombing raids. You can't stop everyone from doing things, but it needs to be, let's say, condemned if there's a peace process in place. It'd be condemned, period. I mean, suicide bombs are not morally defensible. So, secondly, borders of sovereign states need to be established. It needs to be a realistic scenario for the Palestinians. Can Gaza and the West Bank be separated without a land bridge? That seems to be a real difficult proposition to put forward. And the idea that there would be Israeli checkpoints inside a sovereign state, if Palestine is to be a sovereign state, is a non-starter. So, if Palestine is to be a sovereign state, it has to be allowed to be a sovereign state. The third, now we're getting pretty difficult. You have to have restitution for refugees and the right of return. So many Palestinians have moved on and they've created new lives for themselves in other countries and they're not coming back. Those people need to be paid for the property that was stolen from them. The people who do want to come back must be allowed to come back. And they have to live by the laws of whatever country that they're in. So if they come back and they're living in Israel, they must live by Israel's laws. And if they come and they return to Palestine, they have to live by Palestine's laws. And if not, then they'll be asked to leave. But they had property there, they had land there, and they should be allowed to return. This is just an internationally recognized right. All right, water distribution. So here I'm going to read some statistics. The company that's in charge of the water authority in Israel is Merkorot, and it's I can only say a criminal entity in the way that it acts towards the Palestinian people. Only Mekorot is allowed to dig deep wells in the West Bank, and it pumps the principal output from these wells to Israel or Israeli settlements, which, as an extraction of resources from occupied land, violates international law. Of total water available in Israel and the occupied territories, Israel uses between 85 and 90%, leaving the Palestinians, who account for 45% of the total population of the area, between 10 and 15% of the water. Per capita water consumption in the West Bank for domestic, urban, and industrial use is only 26 cubic meters per year, or 70 liters per person per day. So to put that in context, the World Health Organization minimum per capita is 150 liters per day, which means that the Palestinians don't even get half of the recommended total from the World Health Organization. Israeli settlers in the occupied territories use up to 9 times the volume provided to Palestinians. In July and August, when the demand peaks, Mekorot routinely increases the amount of water supplied to the settlers, but does not increase or even decrease the supply to Palestinian towns by closing the valve without any warning. Article 55 of the Hague Regulations limits the right of occupying states to utilize the water sources of occupied territory to military needs that may not exceed past use. Use of occupied territory groundwater in the settlements and its diversion to Israel is therefore illegal. The water situation has to be fixed, and what is happening now to the Palestinians is a disaster in this way. And the Palestinians have to find a way to continue to live. Someone I met in Bethlehem, Palestinian Christian, told me, he said, we build the settlements in the morning and we complain about them in the afternoon. So building an Israeli settlement pays 2 to 3 times more than any other type of similar construction job. And a lot of Palestinians have to work. You have to think about the irony of building illegal settlements in your historic territory in order to feed your family. Those are the sorts of choices Palestinians have to make. And when he told me that, I didn't know what to say. I just thought, and he laughed and he smiled about it. And because I think Palestinians, despite how difficult things are, they really do have a light spirit about things. They have a determination to move forward no matter what. And that's why I do think that with the right combination of circumstances, peace is possible. However, the last point of the 5 that I'm talking about is potentially the most difficult, which is the governance of Jerusalem. It seems that both parties are not amenable to the idea, which I think is the most practical, which is the internationalization of the city. So making it a neutral territory that's governed by outside powers and that people can come and go freely and it doesn't matter. And they're responsible for the security, not either the Israelis or the Palestinians, but this doesn't seem possible to the Zionists. And understandably, the Palestinians want at least East Jerusalem to be their capital. I'm not entirely certain why in practice, the Israelis would want East Jerusalem. When I was there earlier this year, it's 95, 96% Arab. There's not really any Jews living in that area. So I think it's more about the principle of Jerusalem must be run by Jews. And from a Zionist perspective, I understand that, but I'm saying that if there is to be peace, the issue of Jerusalem is going to have to be handled. So do I believe peace is possible? Yes, because the Greeks and the Turks were able to in recent memory, and other more bitter enemies have. But part of that means that the conflict cannot be internationalized. So as long as there is going to be an international component to this, and worse, that it's turned into something of a battle of cultures and religions, then it becomes divinized and almost impossible to solve in the practical order. As long as it can be not about those things, then I do think there's a practical end. But if the narrative is going to be that, you know, God, so from the Jewish side, God gave us this land, and it is ours from the Jordan to the sea, then that's not solvable, obviously. And if the Palestinians take the fundamental Islamic view the Dar al-Harb and the Dar al-Islam, that land that was owned by Muslims must not ever go into the hands of non-Muslims, then they certainly can't allow Israel. Both sides are going to have to compromise with their theological visions in order to come to a practical arrangement for that. And keep in mind, I'm excluding Christians because they've continued to be an overwhelming minority. They've continued to be pushed out of this discussion, but they are a legitimate part of this discussion, minority though they may be. So the last few lines of the book: when a majority of Israelis accord the Palestinians the same right to a homeland that they have won, and when a majority of Palestinians learn to view the murder of Israelis with some of the same moral outrage they express when their own children are killed, they will have laid the true foundations of a lasting peace in the Promised Land. I say that, and the editor, who I had a chance to see in 2021, I think sometime after either the Golan Heights had been annexed formally or the embassy had been moved to Jerusalem, he wrote, "With my apologies for the misleading title of this volume, there is no scenario, realist or otherwise, for a lasting peace after all." I have to disagree slightly, as much as I respect Dr. Trifkovic, that I do think it is possible, because I do think ultimately all peoples want peace. They don't want perpetual war. And if the timing is right and this is not internationalized and it doesn't fall prey to national myths and religious totalism where our way cannot be compromised, then there is a way forward. And I hope for it. I don't think any of us who are observing this very sad situation want anything other than peace for the Israelis and for the Palestinians. I certainly hope for it. So if you'd like to learn more, you can buy a copy to this. There is no audio or Kindle version of this, unfortunately, so all there is the paperback. So I put an Amazon link. There's no bookshop link, unfortunately, to buy the book. They didn't have a copy of it, so you can find it there on Amazon. If you'd like to support the channel, please hit like, please subscribe. And if you'd really like to help, you can either buy a title from the Amazon wish list and get me involved in reviewing that. I've really appreciated all the titles that you all have shared in the comments for the previous two videos. Thank you. I hope to learn more with you in the coming months. And yes, I thought this was just going to be a trilogy, but I suppose I'm going to have to keep talking about these books. Not for every review. This is primarily a book review channel, but not a book review channel only about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I'm going to dedicate one review per month for the next year to this conflict, and that ties in with some plans that I had at the start of next year to go to one review a week as opposed to one review every other week, which is what I've been doing. So people have been very interested in this, and I want to respond and as I say, learn. Thank you so much for your comments. No thank you for the Zionist talking points, which are not willing to take into account the studies that people have done. I hope that people who do continue to repeat those talking points know that if you have an opportunity to read other books other than what you were told in school, you have an opportunity to learn more. Until next time, enjoy your reading.